Hi, in this video, I'm going to break down how to write your learning objective. So the learning objective videos actually will happen in three parts. So this first part of the video one will be on your learning objectives and how to create a learning objective. Video two will be taking your TEKS and converting them into learning objectives. And then video three will talk more about your rationale. So let's get started with how to write your learning objectives. So in writing learning objectives, typically they follow a formula. And so they are very formulaic, and they follow A, B, C, and D. And then I'll break down for you what each one of those letters stands for. So A is for audience. So who is your audience in your learning objective? It's the person or the people who are doing the learning. So in your case, your audience is your students. The students are the audience. So the first part of your learning objective is pretty easy. The students will. If you were writing learning objectives, let's say for a particular student, then you would insert just that student's name. So for example, maybe Rebecca will or Blake will. So if you are, again, writing it for a specific student, then you would insert that name. Or if you were talking about faculty or teachers or whoever your audience is. But again, for your case, for your learning objective, for the lesson plan, it's the students will. B is for the behavior. And so the behavior is the skill or the actual thing that you want your students to be doing. So B is for behavior. Or specifically, it's going to start with the learning action verb. So what verb do you want to use? What is that learned skill that they're going to show or demonstrate you? And so when we look at the TEKS, which you should have watched the video and read over the information on how to find your TEKS and what they are. But when we look at the TEKS, let me pull them up here for history. They're already set in this format without the audience part. Well, actually, here you go. The audience is right here. The student understands that historical events influence contemporary events. This is a learning objective. When you look at your TEK, you're pulling these specific ones here rather than up here. So trace characteristics of various contemporary societies, da, 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 da. This part is that behavior. That is the learned action or learned skill that you want the students to demonstrate. Analyze the historical background, identify and describe the individual or the influence of the individual group achievements. So your behavior always starts with a measurable verb. Now, the problem with TEKS is they don't always have necessarily a measurable verb, like understands is not technically measurable. So let's talk a little bit about how your learning objective needs to be a little bit different from your TEK. So if we come back into here, your behavior, or when you start that learning or action verb, it needs to be SMART, a SMART learning objective. And so S stands for specific. So whenever you write out your behavior part, you'll notice in the TEKS, sometimes it's a little vague or a little broad. And I'm going to have you write something that's much more specific. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the second video. M is for measurable. And so, as I mentioned, not all of your TEKS use measurable actionable verbs. So verbs like understand, appreciate, enjoy, learn, knows, those aren't measurable. So what I'm looking for, and I'm going to really make sure you get pretty specific on what verb you use, is as a teacher, you need to be able to directly see what's happening and what's going on. And that's why we don't use understands as a measurable verb, because you can't really see somebody understanding. What you can see is a byproduct of their understanding, meaning, you know, they're writing a piece for you, or they're identifying on maybe a chart, or they're plotting things, or they're solving problems. That's how you can measure understanding. But for this purpose with your learning objective, you can't use understand, because I want you to say, well, how are you going to measure that understanding? A is for age appropriate. And so because you're choosing from your TEK, those should be age appropriate because you are using a 6th grade TEK or a 3rd grade TEK, and you're not deviating from that. But if you're ever asked to write a learning objective on your own, make sure that it's age appropriate, or sometimes ability appropriate. So you're going to have maybe some students with various types of learning disabilities, and so you also want to make sure that those learning objectives are appropriate and are for your students at that time. So we know that students are at various places throughout the year, and so when you create your learning objective, you want to make sure that it's realistic for your age group, realistic for where your specific class is at the time, and then also realistic to the T, which is time. So with your lesson plan, I'm asking you to do about 60 minutes. And so when you write your objective and you're choosing your TEK, you need to make sure that it actually is time appropriate and realistic for an hour. And so some of the common problems I see is students choose TEKs that won't really necessarily take an hour, or choose TEKs that it's going to take, you know, several lessons to really achieve that outcome. So again, go back and review that TEKs and where to find them, and then we're also going to practice changing some of those TEKs into more specific, smart learning objectives. Okay, and the next part, C. C is for the condition. And the condition is, how are they going to demonstrate that behavior? So in our example that we've been using, the students will count from 1 to 20. How are they going to show you that? So basically, what is the assessment? So thinking about the end in mind, at the end of that lesson, how are they going to demonstrate that they know how to count from 1 to 20? Is it something that you're going to do orally? Or in this situation, they're using manipulatives in the math station to show you. They're doing it maybe on a worksheet, or they're doing it in a different kind of station, or you're coming around and you're watching them do it. So C is how they're going to demonstrate that behavior, or that knowledge, or that skill. And the TEKS doesn't always share that information. They don't necessarily give you the how they're going to demonstrate that skill, but they give you the skill that they need to demonstrate. The D is for the degree, and for the degree, that's what is your expected level of performance for the students. So, and again, in this particular example that I give you, something that would be expected for their level of mastery is to count from 1 to 20 with no errors. As a teacher, again, knowing your student body and your age group, what would be age appropriate, what would be realistic for your age group? It may not be with no errors. It may not be 100%. Maybe it's 70%. Maybe it's 85%. Maybe it's 3 out of 5. Maybe it's 7 out of 10. So your degree is, what is the expected level of performance after you're done with instruction for that particular learning objective? So I've told you the A, B, C, and D, but we're not necessarily going to write A, B, C, and D for your lesson plans. It's an introductory class, and so what I want you to focus on is writing your learning objectives using only your A and your B. So you're going to use the audience and the behavior only. So the audience, again, is the students, and the behavior is what we're going to work on to take your TEK that might be a little bit more broad, or maybe has multiple verbs, or maybe not a measurable verb, and we're going to make that behavior more specific and write your own learning objective from your TEK. So a couple of reminders whenever you're starting to write your learning objectives, which we'll practice here in a second. Remember that your learning objective must be based on your TEK. When you chose your TEK, you also chose your Bloom taxonomy verb, or Bloom taxonomy level. So you have to make sure too that your learning objective verb matches your TEK and matches your Bloom's level. So if you chose Bloom's level apply, you don't want to deviate with your learning objective and have it analyze or remember or understand. So all of those things need to be in alignment: your TEK, your Bloom's, and your learning objective. The also thing you need to be cautious of is you need to focus on one action verb, not having multiple verbs. So you'll notice, again, back in the TEKs, some of these TEKs have multiple verbs: pose and answer geographic questions, identify and describe the influence. So if you're using TEKs like this, you're going to have to narrow down and only choose one main verb that you're going to use out of that TEK. So at this point, we're going to stop here, and the next video will go over identifying maybe some of the issues in the learning objectives, some sample ones, and then also how do we convert those TEKs into learning objectives.